This is going to be the first in a series of lectures on the book How to Think Straight About Psychology by Keith Stanovich. I've got a copy of this here. This is the 7th edition, which is the one that I used when I went through college like 20 years ago. And right now it's on the 11th edition. And in the last 10 to 12 years that I've been teaching college courses, I have never used it. But since I have been the assessment coordinator at Albany State University, where I teach, and have been teaching research methods to psychology, sociology, and criminal justice majors for the last 7 years or so, I've decided to return to it because students are really struggling with scientific reasoning skills. And I see a lot of troubling mistakes that students make with analyzing data, with asking research questions, with interpreting studies, with connecting existing studies together to make syntheses. In other words, there's failures in critical thinking across a wide spectrum. And so the kinds of problems that Keith Stanovich addresses in this book are the problems that I see students making. So these are juniors and seniors in college who are prepared to go on to graduate school, but they're making some very basic scientific reasoning errors. And so I really think a deep dive into the book is essential for any social science student in college, and should definitely be part of the curriculum. So I am doing this lecture series for students who are trying to encounter this book, trying to make sense of it, trying to apply it in their courses, but also in their professions and the work they see themselves doing in the future, perhaps preparation for graduate school, as well as for faculty who want to use this book to teach their courses. When I was in college, I read this as part of a course, and there was no instruction on it. We simply read it, and it made perfect sense to me. I have analytic mind. The concepts came very easily to me. I was able to read about this sort of scientific reasoning and social sciences and then apply it immediately. It just clicked. But I've recognized that not everyone has that skill, has that I guess, intelligence, and perhaps would benefit from a more detailed lecture series focusing on each of the chapters, if only to recognize the difficulties in the concepts as we pass through them, and then possibly just to drive home the points that you get through reading. So what I want to cover in this lecture here is why I'm using it, why I think it's important, and what sort of problems I think that it will address. So I've mentioned already that students struggle with scientific reasoning in psychology. I want to give a couple of examples. So this last semester, students come in with 2 semesters of statistics. They take statistics and math, and then they take a behavioral statistics, which is an applied statistics in the social sciences. And so they come in with the ability to calculate correlation coefficients, mean comparisons like analysis of variance and t-test, and then all the rudimentary descriptive statistics. But what I recognized in asking them questions about their ability to do these computations, what I recognized was a lack of understanding of what it meant. So students would create or do a calculation to get a correlation coefficient, but were unable to use that figure to draw inferences about the sample or the population more generally. They could get a t-test result, but not, and see like a difference in means, but not be able to interpret what the p-value meant or how that factored into what the difference in means represented. I even had one student collect a big sample of data, a really brilliant sample. It was a well-designed study, but when she got the spreadsheet of results, she just gave it to AI, and AI pumped out like this table, and she gave it to me. She goes, "There's what I found," and I looked through it. I said, "What does it mean?" And she had no idea, and she admitted that AI created it for her, but she couldn't interpret it. And this is one of the best students that I had that semester. In other words, students did an excellent job at being able to replicate knowledge, be able to replicate performances. And so this is very rote, kind of concrete, unreflective capabilities, but without the critical thinking component. So there was a disconnect between performance and understanding, or knowledge and understanding. So that's one of the big details that I think Keith Stanovich kind of reiterates over and over and over again in a lot of contexts, as well as demonstrates the danger of these kinds of failures. Another problem that I'm recognizing in students, and this is particularly noticeable in the first year introductory students, but also students getting ready for graduate school. There is a tendency to believe relativistically, or to adopt relativism about everything and anything. So in other words, there might be a study that has a link between a form of intelligence and maybe career aptitude, and students will say, yeah, well, maybe in some contexts, maybe for some people, and everything is interpreted through this, I guess it depends kind of attitude. And while there can be a critical way of saying it depends, the critical way always is in search of the determining contexts and factors. So it depends on what. If you're going to say it depends, or if you're going to refer to or defer to relativism, to what does a specific psychological phenomenon relate? Not to it can't relate to everything. And so part of critical thinking is being able to identify which contexts are the relevant ones, and being able to test them to see if those contexts are indeed relevant, rather than just saying, yeah, I think it probably would apply there. Yeah, I think it would probably apply there. So yeah, I think gender is a factor. Yeah, I think socioeconomic status is a factor. Yeah, I think race is a factor. These can actually be controlled for. These can be tested. We might be able to make an ad hoc hypothesis about why they could be factors, but then we can actually test them in an a priori way. And again, this is the difference between psychology through scientific reasoning and psychology, like folk psychology, or I guess relativistic psychology. I've mentioned these already a little bit, but a couple of deficits that I've seen in critical thinking specifically are the ability for students to recognize relevant context. So when interpreting a phenomenon or interpreting data, being able to say, okay, what are the most important variables? And if I were to design a study, which variables do I think would be most relevant? And then after testing those variables and controlling for the other ones, being able to interpret, okay, yes, that is a relevant factor, or nope, that's not a relevant factor, so let's cross it out, let's move on to the next one. Just the ability to think that way seems to be lacking. This is the inability to evaluate one's own position, one's own perspective, one's own cultural or values biases, is something that I've recognized across the curriculum. So this is in all the gen ed areas, specifically diversity awareness. While there's an ease of learning knowledge about a variety of culturally different others, there is a deficit in recognizing one's own, maybe religious biases, cultural biases, social biases, and so on. And that happens in social sciences and in psychology as well. I see students with personal experiences with depression or anxiety, or maybe alcohol abuse, drug abuse, something that runs in their family, history of trauma. And if they have experienced it, then they have, in their opinion, the most essential perspective available. And while there are avenues to study case studies and subjective experience in a rigorous way, and actually most of my career has been devoted to rigorous methodologies for qualitative inquiry, there isn't any systematic means of examining experience. It's just kind of like any experience goes, and if I've had the experience and I can report it, therefore I'm an expert in the subject, without recognizing that my perspective is one among billions of perspectives, and we can actually be systematic with looking at all those perspectives. That's what we get in a sample, is multiple perspectives, but by looking at them in a large enough group, we can begin to rely on certain assumptions and probabilistic reasoning using statistics, and that's a huge asset. Um, Students are better at recognizing biases in other people's perspectives, but there's still a deficit there. It's like, oh, you've experienced it, therefore you must be an expert. That tends to go. So relativism, inability to evaluate one's perspective and others' perspectives, and difficulty recognizing and identifying relevant contexts. All of this amounts to a divorce between book knowledge, kind of rote knowledge, things that students memorize, not without necessarily understanding them, and then clinical application. And when I say clinical application, that could be in psychotherapeutic contexts, medical contexts, educational contexts, industry contexts, sports contexts, and so on. So any application of those, you can memorize the facts there, you can memorize the facts here, but there isn't a way of maybe drawing inferences between scientific knowledge and application, or specific areas within psychology, intelligence, emotional regulation, psychopathology, and then contexts in maybe education, occupational therapy, places where students may end up working. I would really like to see students learn about the process, the inquiry style of psychology, and then be able to sort of speculate how that same thinking style would play out in a career as a teacher or a guidance counselor or as a social worker, using the same critical thinking skills and the same ability to draw inferences and perform assessments and evaluations and synthesize all of these things together in a meaningful, productive way. And so again, that is why I'm returning back to this book after 20 years or so, and why I'm doing this lecture series. So who is this lecture series for? I would recommend reading the book. That would be preferable to listening to this lecture series. But if you're reading the book and it just seems like a bunch of facts that don't fit together, then you may need some help with the synthesis part, and that's what this lecture is for. So if you're having trouble simply reading it and making sense of it, then hopefully these lectures will help supplement that in a way that makes the reading maybe connect with you a little bit more, and make the information contained in the book more easily applicable in your courses or in your research or in your teaching if you're a lecturer.